Well, hello, encouragers. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I have a special treat for us. My good friend, a former student athlete of mine, and a wonderful leader, Jared Detter, is on the show. Hello, Jared.
Hi, thank you so much
Thanks.
for
So,
having me. I'm really excited.
yeah, this is awesome to reconnect with you. Our history, basically, Jared started at Malone back in about 1997. I remember the fall. And a joke that he and I have with each other. He was one of the first athletes. I actually, have Mr. Ken Rapetta to thank for recruiting you to Malone University as a student athlete. And you came in the first week of class or even during orientation, and you walked in and found my office, and it was a disaster, I'm sure, because I was just getting started. And there's a pile of paper everywhere on my desk. And I think the joke that you tell is that I said, oh, Jared who? Jared Detter. Oh, your name's here on some piece of paper somewhere. And that's how you and I met. And what a wonderful relationship it was for those 4 years. I heard about you. I looked at you. I saw you run one day, I think, and I said, this kid's put together, and I think I know exactly what will be the wonderful challenge that I'll give to him. And so Jared is actually one of the first young men that I ever introduced to the decathlon. And so there is a special fraternity of those of us who have run that event, Jared. And but I'm going to get out of the way, and I want you to just introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and your family and what you've done with life in the last 25 years since you and I were friends.
Yeah, sure. So I was started Malone in 1997, like you said, and I knew I was going to be a psychology major. So all 4 years worked toward my psychology bachelor's degree and graduated in 2001. And because I knew that I wanted to go into psychology, I went right into graduate school, got my master's degree in 2003 in psychology, and got my doctoral degree in clinical psychology in 2006. So basically, for the last 14 years, I've been practicing psychology in one way or another. Primarily, that's been in a therapy setting. People have come to me and done some counseling, whether it's been anxiety, depression, or stress management, or job stress, or parenting issues, or marriage issues, the kind of the most of the things that a lot of people deal with on a day-to-day basis in their life. But for some folks, it just becomes a little bit more impactful, and they feel like they need to get some help from an outside professional. And so that's what I've done. That's primarily been in the Air Force setting. I was an active duty member in the Air Force for 4 years, and went back a number of years later as a contractor on an Air Force base. And I've also done that working with police officers and their family members for the San Antonio Police Department. A more recent development, I would say, in my life is career so far, is that I've been doing some organizational consulting as well. I did that full time for a number of years in the Northern Virginia area, and am trying to get back more full time into that now that I've moved into Canton. By the way, talking about family, my wife is from Canton. She went to Perry High School. Her 4 siblings graduated from Perry High School. Her grandfather graduated from Perry High School. So she has roots in this area, and most of her family is still here. And so we've recently relocated here, and I'm going to be doing some organizational consulting as well as therapy. So those are the kind of the 2 fronts where I do my work, is helping companies become more effective through better leaders and teams, and also helping individuals in their lives through therapy.
Awesome, man. That's great. And you and Rachel are parents to 3 boys, right? Why don't you mention them for us?
Yes, Luke is 13. Justice, which is a biblical name, Justus, is 11, and Micah is 4.
Awesome. Wow, they keep you busy, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Hey, wonderful to reconnect with you. Thanks so much. I really, anytime a podcaster gets the chance to have a guest on with your credentials and your experience, especially at a time like this, it's such a treat. And because I know our listeners are all in many ways facing the stress of the world as it is today. And so what I wanted to do is just first ask you, throw you out a question. I think, you don't have to look very far today in with the virus, COVID-19. In fact, here in Ohio, we were just, handed sort of a mandate to wear masks in public today, starting today. We've kind of been on a roller coaster as a nation with regard to the economy, and then the racial unrest and the incident there in Minnesota, and just the politics and the disagreements, and it's just caused a ton of stress. And from a psychological standpoint, I'm wondering if you might explain to us just the what you've seen and what you know of how people respond to these threats, to this stress.
Mhm. Well, I know that sometimes my wife thinks I was an expert in electrical work or plumbing or something useful around the house, but unfortunately for my wife, I'm an expert in how people think and behave. So I may not be very useful around the house, but I do have insight into how the mind works and how people respond to things, both good and bad. And so my goal here today, obviously, is just to give people a little bit of insight into how we react to these type of stressful situations, and maybe a few ideas on how to become a better person, a better leader in the midst of them. So I think you're starting off at the right place. What essentially happens to us when we're under stress? And COVID-19, all of the racial unrest, all the political maneuvering that goes on in our society absolutely causes stress in people's lives. For many, many different reasons. I mean, with COVID-19, you have people who are at-risk populations. They may have some underlying medical conditions. They may have something like chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, which means that they're not able to breathe very well. And the last thing they need is a disease that causes breathing problems. And so there's stress for those folks. There's stress for people who have lost their job or placed on furlough, or all of these things. There's a minority population in our country that are looking at some of these examples of police brutality, or all of these things or maybe they feel like they don't have a voice during times like this. And so I think what is probably the most obvious thing I'm going to say today, which will resonate with everybody in their experience, is that we are not typically our best selves when we're under stress. And that's an important lesson. Although everybody knows that, we're typically not paying that much attention to ourselves when we're under stress, and the fact that we're not necessarily our best self. So just from a very general perspective, when we're feeling stressed or when we feel like there's a threat, we react with what's called the fight or flight response. And I'm sure everybody here has heard of that before. And basically what that means is our God has created our mind to protect us when we feel like we're under threat. Now, historically speaking, if I were in a loincloth in the savannah of Africa and I had my spear and I heard a growl behind me, that's going to kick in. I'm either going to throw my spear and kill that lion, or I'm going to be lunch for that lion. Either way, my brain is preparing me to either run away or to fight and hopefully survive another day. What's interesting about that is that if I survive, then the threat is over. I've survived. I'm a hero of my tribe, and we've got this lion that we're going to, mount the head on a spike and show how awesome we are. The threat is over. That's not how threats work in our modern environment. Threats are not these discrete threats that come and we resolve it and then it's all done afterwards. If you think about it, you wake up in the morning and you've just been laid off because of COVID-19 and you don't know when your next paycheck is coming. That's not a threat that resolves itself in a short period of time. You're living with that. And so when we're under a threat in our modern society, or maybe it's a difficult marriage that you're in and you don't really know how to fix it, or maybe you have a problematic child, or maybe you are in a minority population. You're not quite sure how everything's going to shake out for you and in your people group in this society right now. It's not a threat that resolves itself overnight. You're living with it. And so in our society, in the modern world, we're essentially living with chronic low-grade stress that from time to time spikes, like with the COVID-19, or with losing your job, or racial unrest, or political maneuvering that's going on in our society. And so we're living with chronic low-grade stress, and it spikes from time to time. And we essentially react in one of two ways. We react with the fight or the flight. The flight is basically anxious avoidance in our society. Maybe you've locked yourself in your house since the beginning of COVID-19 and not come out. Or maybe the one time that you went out, you realized that this is causing you so much anxiety, you decided to buy all the toilet paper in the store so you didn't have to leave the house again. Or we react with fight. And this could be in the form of social media attacks. This could be in the form of rioting, or all these sorts of things that we have. And actually, what I've seen in the news is stores or restaurants or businesses, when they open back up, are put in a very difficult position if they're being forced to tell people that they have to wear masks, because people react with aggression in some of these places when they're told that they have to wear masks, whether that's physical aggression or verbal aggression. And so ultimately what we see is a fight or flight response. And I've got some more to say about that, but maybe we can
I mean, and I think people probably can envision, themselves responding to what they're facing in one of those two ways, but I agree with you that it's not just a discrete incident of stress. It's this nagging, sort of low grade, continuous dark cloud, or this disappointment. I think that's probably what even I'm facing. I'll take my free counseling from my friend here, I guess, but it just keeps going on and on and on. And since about mid-March, we've been facing these changes and disappointments. And so one thing that you and I talked about before we started here was a term that you phrased, or a phrase that you said, a rise of emotionality, And in both of these camps, the fight or the flight, there is this rise in emotionality. What does that mean to you? And maybe explain that a little bit.
Sure. Interestingly, they've done some neuroimaging studies on people when they're under stress. And the two parts of the brain that they're really focused on one is called the frontal lobes, and that's basically right behind your forehead, back through your temples. The frontal lobe is the part of our brain that helps us see the consequences of our behavior, that help us plan things, sequence things, that help us understand more complex issues. And one interesting thing about the frontal lobe is it's also an inhibitor. It's a behavioral inhibitor. And so ultimately, if somebody is really frustrating me and I say, you know what, I'd like to really punch them in the nose right now, the frontal lobe is the part that says, you know what, that's probably not a good idea. A, that's not socially acceptable. B, you're in public, there's lots of witnesses. And C, you're probably going to get arrested if you do something like that. So let's not punch that person in the nose. That's the role of the frontal lobe. The other part of the brain, the emotion centers of the brain, which are more in the center of the brain, like the amygdala, the hypothalamus, those sorts of centers, are really in charge of emotional expression. And so what happens is those two parts of the brain are basically on one end of either end of the same rope. So if you imagine like a tug of war, if one person is pulling on the rope and they're pulling the other person along, the other person is like, there's less and less rope on their side of the pit, so to speak. And that's exactly what goes on with the energy and the metabolism in the brain between the frontal lobes and the emotion centers of the brain. So when we're under stress, those two parts of the brain are now competing for resources. And when we go into the fight or flight response, the emotion centers of the brain essentially win that tug of war. And so when they do these neuroimaging studies, the frontal lobes essentially go dark and the amygdala, the hypothalamus, they light up like a Christmas tree. And so what's kind of fascinating about this is the frontal lobe response to stress essentially looks the same with neuroimaging as somebody who is drunk or has frontal lobe brain damage.
Mm.
That's the degree to which the frontal lobe is shut down. So if you imagine the very part of our brain that helps us think through things, see consequences of our behavior, and acts as an inhibitor that says, maybe this isn't a good idea, it's not working so well. And so we're essentially going to be engaged in behavior that is counterproductive, that is going to be working against what we're ultimately looking to accomplish. And so when I say the rise of emotionality, not only is there emotionality, but the part of our brain that basically says this is a good idea or not a good idea is not working so well.
Mm.
So that's why we see people engaging in behavior that we never would have imagined this person would engage in, whether it's maybe some abusive language over Facebook or some sort of social media platform, or people setting fire to a police precinct building.
Yeah.
When we see this, we never would have imagined a person doing that. But when we are under stress, and when that stress is chronic, and when we get triggered, the emotionality goes, the frontal lobe is shut down, and it's not a pretty sight ultimately.
Right. Well, and that's on one side of the continuum in my mind is the fight response. And so this aggressive outburst or like you say, an action on social media or even during a protest or a riot, we see some of this, and the emotionality of that is what we need to understand. Now, the flip side of it though is in even in my work as a pastor, I'm seeing folks, the rise of emotionality that makes them fearful. And so they're fearful of almost everything. And so talk about that, the other end of the spectrum where a person might be fleeing or not fighting, but they're flighting, so to speak, and the rise of
Yeah.
emotionality in that sense.
So that's a great point. One thing that's interesting about anxiety is it is a self-perpetuating emotional state. So what I basically mean by that is, let's just say somebody's afraid of snakes.
Mm.
And they walk outside their house and they see a snake, they scream and they run inside their house. That's what's called an avoidance response. Anxiety brings about a natural avoidance response in us. And so if I'm afraid of snakes, I walk outside of my house, I see a snake, creates anxiety, I have an avoidant response, I run back inside the house. What do you think that does to my overall anxiety levels regarding snakes?
Yeah.
It goes up. It goes up. And what do you think that does to my overall anxiety levels about going outside of my house? It goes up. An interesting story, and I'll tell it quickly. But 2 nights ago, my wife was awoken by some rustling noise in our master bedroom about 1:30 in the morning. And she elbows me awake. I'm dead to the world. I'm kind of a hard sleeper. And she said that something's going on in our house. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she goes, don't you hear that? And I said, no, I don't. And then I hear some rustling. I turn on the overhead light by pulling the ceiling fan chain. And then it turns out there's this little rodent in our house.
Oh
And my
boy.
wife's freaking out. And I don't know what the rodent is. It's got a long tail, bushy tail, but it's a small creature. I finally trap it in the shower and get it in a bucket and release it outside. But interestingly, last night, my wife's like, I'm a little bit anxious to go to sleep tonight in our
You
bedroom
bet.
because I'm afraid that it turns out it was a flying squirrel.
Huh. There you go.
Now, got into our master bedroom. And interestingly, I was able to record some of that and put it
Oh
on Facebook.
boy.
You know?
Oh boy.
So I did not have the anxiety reaction that my wife did, but she's expressed some trepidation about going to bed in our bedroom last night. Anxiety is something that creates a self-reinforcing avoidance response. And the more you engage in that avoidance response, the more anxiety you feel about that particular behavior. And so although the fight response may have you going out and creating some sort of havoc or damage or harming relationships, the avoidance response creates a self-perpetuating cycle where the anxiety is only reinforced by the avoidance behavior. And that
Right.
is a very hard cycle for these people to break if they're not careful.
Yeah, I really want to pursue that with you a little bit, maybe a little bit later once I'm going to start asking you for some practical advice on that, because I'm facing in my work probably with, like I said, as a pastor and we as a staff, and dealing with folks who are probably more so in that camp than they are out, outwardly expressing themselves, or like you say, these outbursts, or the fight part. It's more of an anxiety about going out, or an anxiety of even going to the store, or going to be where someone else is going to be. And the more this goes on, you're right. The more I've seen that it sort of embeds itself even deeper, and people are having a harder and harder time feeling motivated to go out, or what I believe is that they are fearful. And so, to shift gears with you here, talk to us about the definition of emotional intelligence. So there's a term out there that's, there's an intelligence quotient, your IQ, but there's also the emotional intelligence quotient as well. And so, what's emotional intelligence to someone in your world?
Yeah. So emotional intelligence is something that in the organizational context has really kind of hit its stride in the last decade or so. There's been some books that have been published that are really good at outlining this idea. But the thing that I've noticed is if you go to a textbook definition of emotional intelligence, you're going to get a lot of words that you can understand each individual word by itself, but you're going to have a really hard time understanding the conglomeration of words that they're putting together. So I've kind of created a definition for myself that's a little bit more straightforward. And that's basically understanding how you impact people and understanding how they impact you, and working to manage that impact
Mm,
that they're having on you and that you're having on them. That's the idea of emotional intelligence. And so some of the research that's been done with and presented in a place like Harvard Business Review and some of these other big publications is basically showing in an organizational context, emotional intelligence is more predictive of success than even IQ or your credentials, like your degrees and things
yeah.
like that. Emotional intelligence, basically how you manage yourself around people, is extremely important. And um,
Yeah, and one thing that you mentioned is that, yeah, that's a great definition. I really appreciate you sharing that. Is it's my emotional intelligence is understanding the impact that others have on me and the impact that I'm having on others. And but the way you phrased it was that there's a emotional intelligence disappearing act right now. Sometimes under stress, which I guess by your definition you would lose. The management of your effect on others, and lose the management of others' effect on you. And so that's kind of what I see in some of the political stuff, like just the disagreements about how to solve these problems and how to move forward. And people are just, really angry, and they're disagreeing, but there's this loss of management in essence of that emotional intelligence. Is that kind of how that works?
yes. So I want to talk about a behavioral and cognitive, which is like how we think, cycle that we get ourselves stuck in, that's related to this question of why does emotional intelligence essentially disappear when we're under stress. So one thing that I want to point out is essentially threats are always surrounded by ambiguity, always. So
Mm,
COVID-19, when the cases were starting to spike, there's ambiguity there. How is this going to impact me? Am I going to get sick? Is my family going to get sick? Who out there is going to expose this to me, or me to this? And am I going to expose people to this? Is this going to impact my job? Oh my gosh, an NBA player, Rudy Gobert, just
yep.
in March tested positive, and all of a sudden they shut down the NBA. Wow, if they can shut down the NBA that fast, when are they going to shut down my job, right? Or I see people rioting in my town. Is this going to come in my direction? Are they going to burn down my place of employment, or is my home going to get broken into, or all
Yep.
of these things? Or if I'm a minority, I see a police officer behind me.
Mm,
Is that going to create some anxiety for me? Am I going to get pulled over, and how's that going to work its way out? And so those are all types of ambiguity. And by the way, for ambiguity is kind of a big word. People might not always understand what that means. It basically means we're not really sure one way or the other how it's going to turn out.
Right.
We don't have all the facts. We don't have all the information. We don't know how it's going to impact us. So threats are always surrounded by ambiguities. And so knowing that, let me talk a little bit about the cycle that we get ourselves into when it comes to ambiguities. And this, what I'm about to say, is really important. We tend to interpret ambiguities through the lens of our fears or insecurities. That's really important. And so when there's something in our environment that we feel is a threat and we don't understand how it's going to impact us, we tend to interpret it through our fears and insecurities. And so if I have a personal insecurity about not being liked, and I walk into my place of employment and I see two people who are my colleagues down the hallway talking, when I walk into the hallway, they turn around and look at me, stop talking, and then walk away. If I have a personal insecurity about whether or not I'm liked, I am going to interpret that ambiguous situation as them talking about me. Mm. That's why they stop talking when I walk down the hallway, and they're talking about me. And they don't want me to know what they're saying, which is why they stopped and walked away. If I don't have that same insecurity, and I walk into the hallway and I see two people talking, and then they stop and then walk away, number one, I'm probably not even going to think about it. But number two, if I do think about it, I'm going to assume that they're just done with their conversation. That's it. So we tend to interpret these ambiguities through our fears and insecurities. That's really important to understand, because the interpretation that we have is not linked to any facts whatsoever. Yep. It's linked to our fears. And so what happens when there's an ambiguous situation, we also tend to look outside of ourselves for clarity on what these things mean. We look for guidance.
You bet.
Unfortunately, we only tend to seek out opinions that validate our own. So we're forming opinions based on our fears in an ambiguous situation. We seek for guidance outside of ourselves to help understand this ambiguous situation, but we tend to seek out opinions that validates our own. This puts us in a situation where it only reinforces our own opinions. What's interesting, yeah. and I want this point to come across, we tend to believe people are credible if they believe like us, regardless of whether or not they can support their views with facts. Mm. So if you hear somebody preaching a sermon that sounds like one that you would preach, we automatically believe that they're credible. So wow. Let's back up just a second. Ambiguous situation, we respond through our fears. We seek people outside of ourselves who tend to believe the same way we do. It reinforces our opinion. And it never encourages us to think critically. And so people have heard the idea of this ideological echo chamber, right? That's exactly what that is. We just find voices that sound like our own, and those voices reinforce our own thoughts. So what's interestingly is those ideological echo chambers not only reinforce our own thinking, but it helps us create a sense of contempt for people who believe differently than us. And so this contempt means that we interact with other people who disagree with us in one of two ways. Number one, we have an anger-based approach to trying to change their mind. And spoiler alert, that doesn't work.
Yeah, it often doesn't.
That doesn't work. Yeah. And the second one is we completely dismiss them. If they
cancel. We cancel them.
Culture. I unfriended you because you've made a political statement that I don't agree with. Mm. And then we turn back to our own group to heal our pride through shared contempt, right? And so there is no element of that involves emotional intelligence. There is no element of that when we're yelling at somebody over Facebook that says, am I managing this in a way that's actually going to impact that person like I want it to? And actually, we're undermining our influence with that person when we're yelling at them on Facebook. We're undermining our influence with that person when we do the cancel culture stuff by unfriending them or blocking them from our Twitter account or something like that. So
I think you've just described the existence of several network media outlets, right? Because we either watch one or we watch another, and because of that system that's in place for us, it does in fact work that way. So that's so insightful. I really appreciate this. Let's turn the corner here now, and I want you to give us some practical advice for first. Let's start with maybe the obvious one in a person who is just so upset in what we've just described in the loss of their activity in the frontal lobe, so to speak, and they are a fighter. They've confronted folks. They've gotten angry. They're just kind of cantankerous. We may even have somebody in our family that way, or but if you're feeling that passion and that emotion take over and win the tug of war, so to speak, give us some practical advice for that. We find ourselves in this situation and we just, what do I do? How do I handle this?
Right. So there's a number of things. There's what we want to do is essentially re-engage the frontal lobe for folks. We want to re-engage the part of the brain that helps us think critically and can start sapping some of the energy from the emotion centers of the brain. One thing that research has almost uniformly shown is not only present in people who have overall good mental health, but is very predictive if you're struggling with your mental health in getting better as far as your mental health. And that's doing good things for other people. And so getting into this mindset of service, doing a random act of kindness, because ultimately what I want to point out is that cycle that I just talked about, that is completely fueled by a need to overcome ambiguity through certainty.
There you go. Yep.
Completely fueled. And I cannot blame people for that. I cannot blame people for wanting to overcome ambiguity with certainty. That's part of our nature. We work to minimize ambiguity. We don't like it because it's associated with threat. And so we work to minimize ambiguity through certainty. But certainty in the midst of ambiguity, by definition, is founded on opinion, not fact. So certainty without facts thrives best through superiority. In other words, if you stay humble, you short circuit that cycle.
Yep.
One of the best ways to stay humble is to serve people. Is to be good for people. So when you're going to Walmart and you're frustrated, they're asking you to wear a mask. Instead of kind of stomping around the store being in a foul mood, find an opportunity where you can do something good for somebody in there. If somebody's looking for something but they can't seem to find it, and say, hey, what are you looking for? Maybe I can help you find it, or find an employee that can help you find it. Or somebody drops some money, they don't know it, and pick it up and hand the money back. And interestingly, the other day I was at the office, and somebody was coming downstairs struggling with a heavy bag, and I just asked if I could help them carry that bag down the stairs. And it's just a simple act, and I wasn't having a bad day, but even something like that helps make me feel better. So staying humble, doing acts of service for people, even just random acts of kindness, is a major way that if you can get into that mindset, will completely short circuit that superiority-based, opinion-based, fight or flight, need to conquer ambiguity through certainty cycle.
Oh, that's a great piece of advice. And yeah, I mean, that we need to make that a regular discipline and a regular habit to think of others. Yeah. How about a few words of encouragement for those that might be on the other end and this, fleeing and withdrawal from society is in really based in fear or anxiety, and that cycle that they may be in. What might you say to them?
So what's interesting about anxiety is an entirely self-centered emotion. Again, that is not to place blame. It's not to make people feel bad when they feel anxious, because anxiety is a common feeling across all humanity, right? It's a shared affliction, I guess you could say, across people. But anxiety gets very self-centered. Our sight, not our physical sight, but sort of our emotional sight, gets turned completely inward and focused on ourselves. And so I think one of the best ways to overcome some of that anxiety is to find ways to invest in other people. Now, you might ask how that's different than being humble and doing an act of service. doing an act of service for somebody is sure, it's investing in them, but that's not a consistent type of investment in somebody. So if you're feeling anxious and you're inside the house, maybe you haven't left it in several months, I think finding a couple people in your network who might be struggling as well and calling them and saying, hey, how are you doing during this time? What can I do for you? I know that I'm maybe not leaving the house right now, but maybe I could order some vegetables for you from Target and have them delivered. Like, what can I do for you? How can I invest in you? Can I speak a word of hope in your direction? And what that does, it gets your emotional sight focused outward. The more outward it becomes, the less inward it is, and you're less focused on that. And what's interesting, and although this is good advice for people who are anxious, it's also good advice for people who are more on the angry side, because on the angry side, you're the one who's more likely to try to instruct people, right? You're on social media saying, no, you're wrong for wanting to vote for Joe Biden, or no, you're wrong for wanting to vote for Donald Trump, or Black Lives Matter. No, it doesn't. Those sorts of things. Nobody is going to listen to you if you're not investing in them. It does not work that way. If you try to instruct somebody you have not invested in, it creates defensiveness. And so I think, as my coach for 4 years, you invested an incredible amount of energy in me. And so I think I'm in a situation where if you came up to me, you said, hey, Jared, I think you did something that was wrong. Or I think, you reacted poorly in that situation. Or I think, you have an area in your life where you're not sort of living the way that you say you want to live. I guarantee you, I am going to churn those words over in my head, because you have invested 4 years of your life when I was in college, instructing me, taking me through hard times, discouraging times, encouraging times. And so I'm going to take a real close look at what you just told me. If you're a random person off the street and you say, hey, you shouldn't have done that. Well, who are you?
Yep. Yep.
I don't want to listen to you. So we actually increase our influence over people by listening and investing in them, which is totally opposite of what our culture is today.
Well, and that's maybe as I lead you down to the finish here as we close, that's why leadership is so critical these days, and a special type of leadership, meaning the one that is servant-based, to listen and to guide from a relational, or a relational leadership, not authoritative, not just, positional. Talk to us about that and why leadership is so critical right now, especially given the circumstances we face.
Oh, absolutely. What happens when we get under stress is we tend to abdicate leadership. Like I said, we tend to look towards somebody else outside of us for guidance. We tend to abdicate leadership when we're under stress. And so there is no time better than right now, whether you are the matriarch of your family, whether you are a leader in an organization, or whether you're somebody who's 19 years old, going off to college and not sure whether there's going to be in-person classes or not. Leadership is vitally important, because people are going to be looking to you. People are going to be looking to you. We have things in our brain called mirror cells that basically say, the research says, we tend to do what we see other people doing around us. It means the smallest behavior that you're doing can impact somebody else, because they're going to be watching during trying times, and they're going to be learning from you. And so I guess what I could say is pray for your enemies.
Yeah.
During
Yeah.
times, right? If you're doing something good for somebody you don't appreciate, it's going to change your attitude of superiority toward them, right? And so pray for your enemies, love people around you. And so if I could kind of just say, listen, right? That is a hallmark of good leadership. Many people think that, Patton, General Patton, this is what you're going to do, barking out orders, leading us to victory in World War II is what leadership these days is about. But barking orders is not about leadership, or leadership is not about barking orders. It's about listening. There's almost nothing that you can do to gain more influence over somebody than to listen to them.
Sure.
I would encourage people to listen to people around you. And I think that's one of the good things that this racial unrest dialogue has been about, is like, we're not listening to each other right now. I don't know that we've actually improved our listening behavior much during all of this, but at least that's part of the dialogue. So listen to each other, learn from one another. And I'm not just talking about, like you said, learning from CNN or The View or Fox News. Learn from each other, love each other, and stay humble
Oh,
during these. If you're doing those things well, then you're going to be leading well, and you're not going to be aggressive, and you're not going to be consumed by anxiety during these trying times.
oh, well said, my friend. Listen, I so appreciate that. There is pure gold to be mined into that. So I really appreciate you saying those things. And the last thing that I'll kind of add to that is that, you make a living by listening to people and to helping them process what they face. That's what you've done for a living. That's your vocation. But I know it's a ministry for you, Jared, and so I really appreciate that. And that can be really helpful for people who find themselves in these times very stressed out, and they know that they need someone to listen to them. And so, how can folks get in touch with you if what you've said today kind of resonates with someone, either for them as an individual, or even if they're leading in an organization and they would love to have another set of eyes to just come in and look at what they're dealing with from a counseling or a consulting standpoint? How can folks get in touch with you?
Sure. A couple of ways. Number one is I have an email address. It's jared.detter. And the way you spell my name is Jared .Detter. It's just like better, but with a D, at profectusperformance.com. So that's Profectus is PROFECTUS performance.com. And so that's my email address. Profectusperformance.com is the website. And I'm also on LinkedIn. So
Awesome.
look me up, Jared Detter on LinkedIn. Shoot me something if you're interested in continuing a dialogue with it, or getting help for yourself personally, or expanding your leadership impact in an organization. And I just have to say that what you're doing with this podcast is fantastic. One of the best ways to manage your own emotional intelligence and to get through times like this is encouraging people.
Yeah.
And the whole point of what you're doing, these podcasts and Encouragers United, could not be better placed in what our culture is going through right now. So thank you for making it part of your mission to encourage people.
Oh, that's nice of you to say. Really appreciate your time, Dr. Jared Detter. It's awesome to connect with you. Thanks again for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you.